isolating world which can consume all joy and feel never-ending. We went on the local scene to the Plymouth Public Library to talk to grief specialist Gary Sturgis, who shared his story of loss and journey to healing and a sense of peace.
Welcome to the Surviving Grief workshop. I'm happy you're here. I'm just sad that you need to be.
We had a patron who came in and she said, you know, finding an in-person grief group was really challenging. Then I chimed in that last year I had lost both my mom and my dad. So I know kind of what she was going through. And when Gary approached me, I said, okay, this might be a perfect opportunity to bring the topic of surviving grief and grief counseling to the library.
And that's what I do. I talk about the stuff that nobody else wants to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about grief, loss, or death.
I lost my spouse in 2014 to stage 4 pancreatic cancer, which is a fancy term for really bad cancer. I was left with really just grief, and I didn't know what to do with that or where to put it. So he would always say to me, it's all good, you know, if I was worried about something. So that's actually on his gravestone, it's all good. So I always think of him when I think of it's all good. When he died, I felt like the loneliness was so intense. And I always say that a future with only sadness and sorrow in it is a pretty grim prospect. And I think that it's important to tell your story, like tell it over and over again. And what the problem is, and I call it like the time after the casseroles stop coming. Nobody wants to hear the story anymore. And sometimes the only people that really want to hear those stories are people that also lost a piece of their heart. I joined a grief support group. I also did one-to-one grief counseling. And I became a volunteer bereavement facilitator. So I was a peer facilitator. I would sit in the group and I would tell my story to them and kind of share what I did and how I survived my grief. And then as that went on, I progressed into pretty much getting promoted to doing the groups on my own. My workshop was born out of the fact that I was hearing the same thing over and over in the grief support groups that I was facilitating. So I decided, you know, this would be really helpful, I think, to almost put it into like a grief 101 type of thing. And because I think when we fear something if we don't know about it. So if we don't understand grief, we fear it more. C.S. Lewis said in his book, A Grief Observed, no one ever told me that grief was so like fear. Even though grief is unique to everyone and everyone's relationship is unique, there's still a lot of the same similarities that we all go through when we lose someone we love. If someone was new to a loss and asked me like what my advice would be, I would say seek help. You know, whether it's a support group, whether it's a one-on-one, you know, a person that specializes in therapy on grief and loss or trauma, because a lot of people suffer trauma as well. Hope Floats in Kingston, which is a health and wellness center. They do everything from grief support groups. I do my workshops there. They have guest speakers that come in. They have yoga classes. They have a kids club. Just a lot of great resources there. I also always tell people definitely, again, seek a specialist in grief counseling or even read books. I have a book called Surviving Grief, 365 Days a Year. So you read one daily reflection for every day of the year. I also have Coping with Grief During the Holidays workshop. The thing about holidays when you're grieving is usually the anticipation of the day is actually worse than the actual day. So when the day comes, you realize that this day pretty much sucks just like all the other days do. But people struggle with the holidays because holidays are supposed to be a happy time, you know, and if someone is missing from that happy time, it puts a whole new twist on it. So what I try to share with them in the holiday workshops is I try to give them coping skills for what to do, what not to do. It's all about what's going to bring you comfort. I always tell people if they remember one thing from my workshop, it's if someone asks you to do something, ask yourself this question: is doing this going to make me feel better, or is doing this going to make me feel worse? And that will usually help you through whatever you're doing, including the holidays. I feel like when I do not only a support group, but the workshops as well, is when all these people are gathered together and they're all there because of a loss, I call it like you find your tribe. You know, you find these people that get what you're going through, understand what you're going through, and you can talk about your dead person without feeling bad about it. There's no cure for grief, but if there was a cure for grief, I would say it's motion. And what I mean by motion is moving forward. So when someone dies, like we want to move back. I always use the analogy of like whitewater rafting. You know, you're in this raft and you're going down this rapid river. What do you do if you fall out of that raft? What's the procedure to do? Well, your gut instinct is to struggle. I gotta get back. I'm getting pulled down. But what they tell you is cross your arms, cross your chest, put your feet up, and let the current just take you down. And it's the same way for grief. You know, if you start trying to go back, you're gonna get stuck. So the only way to get through the grief and to get through the pain is to work through it. And I call it the grief work. And to do the grief work, that's how you move forward from the loss. It's motion. It's that forward motion.